Thank you. So welcome everybody to this online symposium for emerging leaders in prevention. Focused on systems leadership, and we're really excited that we've got people joining from all over Australia, from prevention research, policy agencies, prevention programs, and practitioners from all levels of government. I'm really excited about the enthusiastic response and the number of registrations, and we really hope that you enjoy the day. My name is Lucy Wright-Chetnick, and I'm the co-director of the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre, and I'm just going to be doing a brief welcome. And I'd like to begin by saying that the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre and the Collaboration for Enhanced Research Impact, or CERI, acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. We're all joining virtually, but I think it's important to remember the importance and the meaning of place. I'm joining you from the beautiful Darawal country, a couple of hours south of Sydney. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands and the lands from which you are all joining, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I'm going to give a brief welcome and an introduction and say a little bit about the Prevention Centre and who we are and what we do for those who don't know, and a little bit about the Collaboration for Enhanced Research Impact, which is a collaboration between the Partnership Centre and 10 NHMRC funded centres of research excellence all around Australia. And the young leaders from that collaboration have been the ones who've led and organised this symposium. So they're not only emerging leaders, they've clearly already emerged as leaders. I've been working in public health and prevention for nearly 4 decades, showing my age as a dietitian, a community nutritionist in health promotion, migrant health, and then many years in research and research translation. And I'm just going to share a few reflections on a few points in relation to the topic of today of systems leadership. And then I'd also like you to think about what you would like to get out of today. And Tara, who's going to be introducing the speakers, will return to that at the end of this morning's session. I thought it would be nice as well if you wanted to introduce yourselves in the chat, if you just want to say who you are, your role, and what country, traditional country you're joining from. It would be nice for everyone to see where we're all coming from all around Australia. So the Prevention Centre, just a few words about the Prevention Centre. So the Prevention Centre's focus is building capacity and applying systems thinking across the prevention system and supporting the future leaders in prevention research, policy and practice. And the Prevention is supporting and hosting CERI as well. It's very much a partnership model, and here you can see our policy and practice partners. So it's a real collaboration between researchers, academics, and the current and future leaders in policy and practice, based on co-design principles, where jointly researchers and practitioners and policy partners collaborate to develop new projects. And it's also based on the design of pooled funds for shared values. So our partners are contributing and we're working on priorities that apply across all of the jurisdictions. And the real focus is on applied and innovative prevention research. So we've done about more than 60 projects since its inception in 2013. Just a little bit about the university partners as well. So as you can see, the project leads of the research that's supported are based in universities all around Australia. And it really supports collaboration across institutions and across the jurisdictions and our funding partners, with lots of evolving communities of practice. And over time, we've also expanded our role in the people that we work with. So there's been an increasing focus on the convening and the coordinating roles of the coordinating centre, the translation and the communications expertise that we're able to share across jurisdictions and across universities. And from that, we've had this amazing emergence of the Emerging Leaders Network, which is a network of researchers and partners and practitioners, NGOs and local government, many of whom are joining this seminar today. The other collaboration that I really did want to mention, and it's one of the most exciting and recent developments, is CERI, so Collaboration for Enhanced Research Impact, or CERI. It's a collaboration between the Partnership Centre and 10 centres of research excellence who are all working in the area of prevention. And these centres and the Prevention Centre collaborate on advocacy, making the case for prevention, writing joint stories and reporting of their research, aligning that reporting so that decision makers are not getting conflicting messages from different centres and research centres. They've also collaborated on knowledge synthesis and providing shared opportunities for building skills and leadership roles for early and mid-career researchers. So like I said, this symposium is very much the initiative of the leaders from SERI. They've developed the ideas, the topics and the speakers. So I think definitely demonstrating systems leadership. So finally, some reflections related to the topic of today of systems leadership. So why do we do the work that we do? I want to talk a little bit about the idea of prevention really being about creating change, very much related to our topic. It's about creating change through the organised actions of society. I also want to make the point that I think systems thinking and systems methods and tools in prevention and public health is an example of a paradigm shift that's currently underway. And I'll say a bit about what that might mean. And then a bit about the importance of new relationships and mutual trust and networks. So why do we do what we do? Obviously, those of us who are working in public health and prevention, it's a values-based profession and we want to change things for the better. People are drawn to it because of their belief in collective action, the coordinated interventions of government and wider society, focusing on sort of structural changes, for example, like regulation to protect the public from the excesses of harmful industries. Now, that might seem obvious for people working in policy and practice, but that change focus has not always been the main focus of research. And those of us working in research are not just wanting to understand and describe problems, we're also wanting to create change in the real world. And I think the focus on strengthening the links between research and practice has been underway for a very long time. So when I was doing my Masters in Public Health in 1995, as my MPH treatise, I did a review of health promotion journals over 5 years. And one of the key findings was that there was way too much focus on descriptive research. So people describing problems, explaining them, but there was very little research focused on intervention evaluations. I think we developed a very good understanding at that time of what was causing problems, what was causing public health problems. But really, we had very little evidence of what works. And my point is that I think the first paradigm shift, or the more recent paradigm shift before systems thinking, was the era of evidence-based medicine. And that was from the 90s to 2000. So I think those of you who are young and are new to, relatively new, only last, say, 10 or 15 years to prevention and public health, evidence-based practice is just mainstream and normal. But certainly in the 1990s, it was seen as a radical new approach to public health. And the idea of a paradigm shift was described in the 60s by Thomas Kuhn, who talked about the normal science and then the radical changes that happen. So normal science is where the assumptions and the rules and the technologies are standard and accepted, and they're the usual way of solving problems. And then a crisis happens because people realize it's no longer useful, and we end up with a paradigm shift or a revolution where the majority adopt a new worldview. And I think the shift from traditional medicine to evidence-based practice really was a paradigm shift that was happening in the 90s and the early noughties. And the real focus there was on clinical epidemiology and using randomized controlled trials and quantifying the probability of outcomes and the risks of interventions, the hierarchies of evidence, the idea that some evidence is better than others, the critical appraisal and the graded recommendations that were developed. So recommendations were graded according to the quality of the evidence that supported them, and evidence-based guidelines. And the concept of evidence synthesis, again, is just mainstream and normal approaches to policy and practice now. But the Cochrane collaboration was named after Archie Cochrane, who was the grandfather of evidence-based practice. And these paradigm shifts do take a generation to occur. So 5 or 10 years after EBM, or evidence-based medicine, was first coined, it was still considered as relatively new, and people took another decade of learning the language and the methods and tools of searching for evidence. And now it's standard, but I think we have much stronger evidence of what to do as a result of that and what works and how well it works. But I think the ongoing challenge is how to make things happen in the real world, and particularly on a larger scale in a way that's sustainable. So the focus now is less about individual programs and more about the need to change entire systems. And the ongoing critiques of evidence-based approaches have included the fact that they don't sufficiently take account of the complexity of problems and that randomized controlled trials deny the influence of context. So my reflection for you today is that I think we're undergoing a new paradigm shift, and that's about systems thinking and systems change. And I would say it is a radical new way of thinking for public health. And we went to the Preventive Health Conference, the PHA Preventive Health Conference recently. A number of us went there. And it was becoming increasingly mainstream that people were referring to systems approaches and systems thinking. The new National Preventive Health Strategy refers to systems approaches. And it's really becoming a standard way of thinking about the way to create change. And those working in policy and practice may well say, well, we've always addressed complexity and we've always applied a systems approach. And so maybe it's just that research is actually catching up with the realities of policy and practice so that we've got better methods and tools and theories to measure and quantify what's happening in the real world. I think some of the key issues that are emerging through systems thinking, and I'm sure you're going to be discussing a lot of these today, people like Steve Allender, who you'll be hearing from, and Diane Feingold, who've been promoting the approaches of systems approaches in public health as the way to answer the problem of creating large-scale change and studying and researching that. But issues like emergence and allowing things to happen organically, understanding and trusting the power of systems to evolve and adapt, and also the importance of networks and relationships. And that comes to my final point. I think relationships really are key to creating change. And I think that's an important contribution of today. It's wonderful that people are joining today. And today is an opportunity for you to meet new people, whether you're working in policy and practice to meet researchers, whether you're researchers to meet practitioners, or for researchers to meet each other from other parts of Australia. And a lot of people who've worked in public health and prevention for a long time talk about the importance of those relationships and how people that they met early in their career when everyone was relatively junior, how important they continue to be when people take up senior roles. And those trusted relationships, how important they are for enabling change to occur. So I'd encourage you all to network, enjoy today, connect with each other, get to know people, make the most of it. You're the future of prevention and you're the future change makers. So I hope today will be really useful. And with that, I'll say thank you and hand over to Tara, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you for that introduction, Lucy. So I'm Tara Bolson-Robinson. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Deakin University, and I sit within the CRE Refresh, which is the CRE on healthy food retail. And today I'm calling in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So we have 4 excellent plenary speakers today, and they're going to talk for about 10 minutes each, and then that's going to be followed by a 40-minute Q&A session. And so with the Q&A function, you'll see on the top right hand of your screen, there should be a Q&A function where you can ask questions. So please ask questions throughout the speakers' sessions, and then I'll be moderating them and asking them during the facilitated Q&A. So first up, we have Adjunct Professor Janine Mohamed, who is CEO of the Lowitja Institute. And we're very lucky to have Janine here today for many reasons. Unfortunately, she's a little bit under the weather, and so she's luckily agreed to still do her talk, but she won't be joining us for the Q&A session, unfortunately. Dr. Mohamed is a proud Narungga Kaurna woman from South Australia. Over the past 20 years, Janine has worked in nursing management, project management, research, workforce and health policy in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health sector. Many of these years have been spent in the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector at state, national and international levels. Janine has been based on the Wurundjeri country in Melbourne since 2019 as the CEO of the Lowitja Institute. Australia's National Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research, and explores key topics in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, such as cultural safety, the social and cultural determinants of health, workforce, and Indigenous data sovereignty. Amongst many, many awards and recognitions, in 2021, Janine was awarded a Distinguished Fellowship by the George Institute for Global Health Australia. And we're very lucky to have her here today to talk to us about who the system works for and who it excludes, and to reflect on her own experiences in changing systems and in creating new ones. Janine, over to you.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Lucy, for that acknowledgement, and good morning, everyone. So before I begin, I need to acknowledge, and you've already heard, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'm fortunate to live and work on these lands, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course to future emerging generations. And many of you are online today, and of course our collective work together is so important for what I'm going to talk about today. It's really important for me to, let you know my standpoint, and Tara's already alluded to that. I am an Narungagana woman, and this is my country just here on the slide, and that's a little place called Point Pearce, and it's a mission in South Australia. You've also heard I'm the CEO of the Lowitja Institute, which is Australia's National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community-Controlled Health Research Institute. And I'm very pleased that the team has asked me to talk to you today on the topic of what good system leadership looks like for prevention. And I suppose you might expect me to begin with how our improved participation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples in diabetes control or cancer screening, and that has been improved, has been brought about by good system leadership, and then to unpack what the components of good system leadership is. But for me, central to any discussion on system change is for me to really begin to share with you my understanding of what we mean by the system. And to think about, and I love this slide that I often use, please soak it up, take a photo, because it won't be up there very long. It's really about thinking about who has created the system, who benefits from the system, and to think about who has historically been locked out of the system, what's been swept under the rug in terms of historical truth-telling, and who's not been involved in its creation, and therefore who's not benefiting from that system. And to think about when you're in the system, and of course benefiting from that system, it can be hard to see how others are locked out. And it's really easy to resist change. And I'll talk a little bit about that today, resistance to change, even if that's subconsciously, and it might be unsettling. I'll begin by quickly unpacking this slide, which is on dominant culture. It's a big concept that I don't have time to fully unpack with you today, but it'll give you a sense. But when you're a member of dominant culture, your identity is constantly affirmed and reinforced in ways that you possibly don't even realise. But for those of us living outside of this dominant culture or mainstream, it can be really challenging. So our identities, our ways of knowing, being and doing are rarely acknowledged or affirmed by dominant culture. And I learnt this concept whilst, learning about cultural safety and being in cultural safety training, and about, how our, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, our whole of society, actually, the social soup that we swim in, our set of values, beliefs and standards, and the systems that govern and organise our lives, and that were established as normal or mainstream, were brought here by the British when they claimed and colonised Australia. And of course, this dismissed Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. And it's really difficult for me to talk about prevention without talking about cultural safety, the training that I've done and that I've dedicated most of my life to, and what it means for people to be actually harmed by systems that are actually meant to heal them. So I'll talk a little bit about cultural safety. And it starts with pointing out that there's a big difference between cultural awareness and cultural safety. Most people have done cultural awareness training. With cultural awareness, you tend to focus on improving your knowledge about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. So the gaze is outwards, if you like, and it can be quite comfortable. With cultural safety, the gaze is inwards. Non-Indigenous peoples are asked to critically examine themselves, their own worldviews, assumptions, beliefs, really understand historical truth-telling. It's about examining and understanding racism and the implicit biases we hold, and to understand how these views and beliefs are often formed intergenerationally and are embedded in organisations and in our systems, and how they come to mean life or death for my people. And there are many tragic stories that speak to the truth of culturally unsafe care for my people. This is Naomi Williams. She was a 27-year-old Wiradjuri woman who was pregnant, and she died of septicemia, a very preventable death at Tumut Hospital in 2016. The coronial inquiry into Miss Williams' death found that she went to hospital 15 times in the months before she passed away without receiving one referral to an expert. This is Miss Do. She was a 22-year-old Yamiji woman who died in custody in Western Australia in 2014 because of deficient medical care. The coroner found that both the police and the hospital staff were influenced by their racial bias. Their deaths were painful and they were preventable. They could be still here with us today, with their families if the system had been safe for them. So with them in mind, I would like to talk to you to our subject in the context of working within the system for reform, and secondly, having alternative systems. So one of my most positive experiences that I've had in system reform when I was the CEO of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, or CATSNM. We worked with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal nurses to embed this notion that I've talked to you about, cultural safety, into our education standards and into our codes of conduct for nurses and midwives. And we've even actually taken it to AHPRA, which is our national registration body, to embed it into legislation. But system disruption always brings about people disruption, and this notion that I encourage you to look up, which is cognitive dissonance, which is people, having their truth challenged. And some people won't be happy with change, and some will seek to inflame the situation. So as a result, to this work that we were doing, we faced a historical and ill-informed reaction amongst some of the profession that we worked with and elements of the media and public. And what made such a difference for us was that our non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery leadership and allies were really solid in their support for cultural safety and for us. Many of them had done cultural safety training, so they were on the same page and had done a lot of critical self-reflection. So these non-Indigenous women understood their power, their ability to open doors and allow us to step in, and also their privilege, and that it wasn't the work of Indigenous nurses and midwives to counter the backlash. It was their work. So it's an important example for me, I think, that I want to share with you, particularly given that we've just had NAIDOC and its powerful theme of get up, stand up, show up. That these non-Indigenous nurses did that. They got up, they got educated about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and about themselves. They stood up, they stepped into their responsibility, and they kept showing up. So even when the times got tough, in fact, when the times got tough, that's when the magic happened. And knowing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up just 3% of the Australian population, so we can't do all of this work, also knowing that many of us are not in positions of power. So it's an important message that I want to bring about system change. And the last one is, alternative systems. Lowitja Institute is just that. We were established 20 years ago because many of our people had been locked out of the research process. Our voices weren't heard. They were not sought. They were not valued. Research was done on us, not by us and for us. And researchers in our communities documented our lives and how they saw our lives, at least. And they would leave, never to be seen again, and rarely deliver any benefits. Often, those benefits were to their careers and their own funding. And this meant research was embedded in what we call deficit discourse, the problem with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples instead of the problems we faced, and placing the blame on the system. And that narrative led straight in the line to damaging policies that have seen, the deficit discourse and the silencing of our voices, which, fed into the national psyche here in Australia and to a narrative about our peoples. And that's come at a great cost to our families and communities and our cultures and our countries. And it's allowed things like this to happen, the stolen generation. So just a little bit about Lowitja. We've changed that narrative, to be strengths-based. And 2 years ago, we fulfilled our vision of becoming community-controlled, which meant that now we're able to privilege Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander researchers and organisations. That means that 100% of the money that we commission out to research go to our people. And that's compared with less than 10% of funding by NH and MRC into Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander issues, led by Indigenous researchers from 2010 to 2016. And yet, of course, NH and MRC, that holds the bulk of the purse strings that go into Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health and research. An example of our work is, and why that matters, is the Miracle Way study. You heard a little bit about the work that Lowitja does in cultural determinants. This was groundbreaking work done by Professor Ray Lovett, looking into the cultural determinants of our health. It's measuring for the first time how Indigenous wellbeing and health is linked to things like connection to country, cultural practice, spirituality and language, and it will provide evidence for the creation of better policies and programs. But initially, Ray couldn't get funding for the Miracle Way study. Mainstream bodies didn't really understand what he was trying to research. And the Lowitja Institute backed Ray's work because we knew what the cultural determinants were about. And now other research bodies are beating down his paths. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just end with, the key point to this is that our worldview on research is different. Western methodologies don't revere, medical models. Western methodologies revere medical models and methodologies, and we revere Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. So we've had to come up with this alternative system, and we seek to ensure that knowledge from research is translated meaningfully to our mob, and it's not just tucked away in a medical journal. And our work must impact our communities and make sure that they're benefiting from their research, not locked out of research and systems. So thank you. And I'm sorry I can't join you for your questions later. And I hope you're able to hear my voice. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Janine. That was really fascinating insights into how we first need to kind of question the systems that we're born into to then work out how to change them and to also consider what alternative systems are needed. If you want to find out a bit more about the work that Janine is doing, then please visit the Lowitja Institute website. And if you have any questions, I know, Janine can't stay for the Q&A, but if you have any questions that you might want this other speakers to reflect on that resonate with anything that Janine has said, then please do put them in the Q&A function. So next up we have Professor Katina Denise, and Katina is the Executive Director within Prevention and Population Health at Wellbeing, South Australia, responsible for leading the Directorate to build better health outcomes and avoid or defer the onset of preventable disease and disabilities using evidence-based prevention and health promotion strategies. A public health physician and epidemiologist, Katina has previously worked in communicable disease control, including for COVID-19, Aboriginal health and academia. Katina's special interests include legislative reform, research translation, and Aboriginal health and health equity. And Katina is going to reflect today on her experiences in translating research into practice and what the factors are that you need to consider to make that happen. Over to you, Katina.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming along to listen today. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Katina people. And I also want to acknowledge Janine, who may well have already left the meeting, but the seminal May Kuai study that she referred to actually forms the basis of our cultural strengthening framework for Aboriginal health promotion in South Australia. So that work has directly translated into system reform, so it's fantastic. So I'm going to talk about something that feels substantially less profound, but I'll try to make it useful for you. So what I really wanted to talk about today was how we could use research to create system change. As Lucy was talking about earlier, I think that what we need to be focusing on as public health people is actually the sorts of reforms that change systems and change them permanently, or at least substantially permanently. And legislation is a way that we can do this in a way that reaches a good enough dose across the population and can't really be shifted easily. But what we know is that when we do research, there is always a delay. In medical research, that delay is 17 years, usually, on average, between research published and any sort of translation. In public health, it's substantially longer. We go for decades before we can translate things that we know need to happen. I won't spend too much time on this, but just so that people are aware, people understood that tobacco was a problem from the 1940s. It took 3 decades before the first very simple reforms came into place in the 70s. And in reality, the reforms that actually shifted things started in the mid-80s. So we're talking 45 years between when we knew we had a very serious problem and when we were able to shift the system. So I guess then what do we do about this? For the vast majority of the things we need to do in public health, I think we actually know what we have to do. We know what the problems are, we know what we need to do, but what we struggle with oftentimes is how to move it from the research to the real world. So I'm going to give an example here where I talk about a few key factors to think about. One, about getting the questions right, how we can use the literature to help us, timing, and our stakeholder relationships. So I'm going to take an example of dog bites in South Australia. So basically, this graph shows up to the time before the reform, what was happening with regards to admissions to hospital. We knew that they were rising. We knew that the number of dog registrations were rising. And so basically they coupled. More dogs meant more bites, more admissions to hospital. All the sorts of usual things that people do, like, try to do widespread education programs, even focusing on different target groups, had all happened. And people had been working on this for a very long time with nothing was really changing. This is obviously not surprising to health promotion people because education in an unsupported environment rarely is effective. So we basically had to look at multiple different facets to get something different. Now, what we looked at here was the importance of stakeholders. I just want to reinforce that in the space of something like dogs, for example, we have councils, we have also the animal welfare groups, we have community, we have dog owners. There are a number of people who are involved in this concept of dogs and how they're managed. What we looked at was in the literature, identified pretty early that there appeared to be an association between dogs that were desexed being less likely to bite. And when we looked at this across all of our stakeholders, we found that there were other stakeholders who had an equal interest in desexing of dogs as a routine practice, not because of bites, but because of their own agendas. So same process, different outcome, but it basically meant that people could basically come together over the issue of desexing of dogs. So obviously for the animal welfare groups, that's more about unwanted dogs and dog euthanasia. So I just want to make the point that we don't all have to have the same outcome in mind, but if we can come together on the same matter, then that actually gives us a much more powerful argument for system change. So in terms of the evidence and how we use this, it was actually only a handful of studies, a couple of case controls, a couple of cohorts and case series studies that we had. So going back to what Lucy was saying, we would say this was very low quality evidence, certainly in terms of being able to do some kind of intervention. But what we can do as public health people in this space, because of course there is not going to be a randomised controlled trial of desexing for dog bites. So what we can do instead is take a multi-view of the literature. So this is a way of trying to confirm for ourselves, whether we think we have something causal here or whether we think we have something just descriptive and association. So certainly found that and for this we use triangulation. So we might take different methodologies, and if they point to the same direction, that can give us some comfort that what we're looking at may be causal. And in this, we could also look at animal behaviour research. So not just our epidemiological research, but what actually happens with the sexing of dogs in terms of the behaviour of dogs. So we could bring in another whole discipline as well. And one of the really critical pieces of information here was actually a case series. And I know that that's normally something that we would be disdainful of in public health, but in this instance, because of the rarity of the outcome of death as a result of dog bite, it was important. So there was a study published in the United States that found 238 of 256 attacks leading to death had dogs that were not desexed. So this actually was an important part of the whole picture. So it was really bringing all of it together as a total picture that gave us confidence that there was something in the desexing of dogs relating to dog bites. But when we're trying to do system change, it's not enough to have that we understand what the issue is and understand what we need to do. We also need to convince the decision makers. And that can be quite tricky. And certainly when you're trying to do legislative reform, that is the difficult bit. But remembering we had a coalition of very important, powerful groups across South Australia who came together on this matter. We had good enough evidence, and what we did to actually shift the dial was a citizens' jury. So this goes to the point that actually politicians don't make legislative reform without the majority of the population actually supportive. And that makes sense. They're our elected representatives. So what we did here was basically, citizens' juries, they can be, this was a moderate sized one. I think we had about 35 people. But what they are is deliberative democracy process. And it takes people from a range of, so it should be random. We should be seeing a representative of society. And what we found was that when people had the opportunity to ask lots of questions, not just of relating to dog bites, but to all matters relating to dog control, that we had a unanimous jury in favour of mandatory desexing of dogs. This was a seminal thing because it just meant from a politician's perspective, they could see that actually if people, once this is understood, the vast majority of people are going to kind of be supportive. And so because of all of that, we were able to actually translate into legislation in South Australia. Now, in terms of how we see this working, it's going to be slow because it only relates to new dogs and it didn't come into effect straight away. So we're expecting to see a kind of a transition over 10 years, really. It is the case that younger dogs have a tendency to be more likely to bite, but it's not exclusive. And so we're kind of not expecting to see very much for a little while, and in a couple of year times we're expecting to see at least a 30% reduction. That's what we would expect from the literature that we have. But I really just wanted to, I've given examples of importance of stakeholders, importance of using evidence in a sophisticated way, and the importance of the community being on our side. I think they're all critical pillars when we're trying to do system leadership, but perseverance is that's where it comes down to us. Nothing in public health happens quickly, really. I guess we could say pandemics cause a bit of quick, but it's an unusual thing. And certainly in the world of chronic disease prevention, basically we need to just keep working at something. The reform that I've just talked to you about, which looked like it was quick, was 8 years. And so it's about stepping into the complexity, knowing where you want to end, but allowing yourself that opportunity to shift and respond to whatever it is in front of you. So basically what we're doing then is just making the next best decision to get to our goal. It doesn't mean we know what the subsequent decision will be or even what will be required, but it's basically allowing yourself to sit in uncertainty, but to maintain your one-eyed focus on that outcome and persevere. I think, yes, I couldn't say that enough. That's all for me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Katina. That was a really fascinating example of what it takes to enact policy change. So just a reminder, if you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A. We've got quite a bit of time for the Q&A, and I definitely don't want to be only asking questions that I'm interested in. I want to hear from all of you as well. So please do pop some questions in there for us. So now we have Professor Stephen Allender. So Steve is a professor of public health and founding director of the Global Obesity Centre, GLOBE, at Deakin University, a World Health Organization collaborating centre for obesity prevention since 2003. Steve has an ongoing program of research on solving complex problems with a focus on the burden of chronic disease and obesity prevention. Recent work from Steve has seen a particular interest in the burden of chronic disease, malnutrition and climate change in developed and developing countries, and the possibilities for using complex systems approaches for community-based interventions. Steve leads 2 NHMRC partnership grants on community-based childhood obesity strategies and is a lead investigator for the Centre of Research Excellence in Healthy Food Retail. The European Union Horizon 2020 co-create grant for healthier policy in Europe. And I have been told by Steve that I'm not allowed to call him a systems science expert, but rather someone who uses systems science in their research. But I'm really looking forward to hearing about how Steve sees the role of the academic in the systems and what he means when he is talking about systems. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Tara, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. And I just want to acknowledge I'm coming to you from Wadawurrung country on the beautiful Bellarine Peninsula. Acknowledge leaders past, present and emerging. And also Steve probably needs to update his bio, I think, by the sound of that. But I'm pleased to have 10 minutes with you. And I'm going to agree a lot with everything that's been said so far. And the intention I've got in this period of time is really to think a little bit more about if I was at the start of an academic career and I was trying to get my head around this idea of systems thinking and using systems science, what does that look like and what are the sorts of things I'd think about? And I've put this slide in here and it really reflects a lot of what we've already heard, but to make the point that we are academics and as systems leaders, that's very different to somebody who's working in a particular field trying to create social change out in the world. So this is a slide full of people who have been working for decades and decades and decades to create social change. And I think Lucy and Janine and Katina all made the point that actually lots of people navigate systems and complexity in their daily work and do a brilliant job of that. And the academic's role in understanding that and using it for change is a slightly different one. So I just want to make the point that when we say system science is useful, and I agree with Lucy saying there's a paradigm shift happening, it's important to think about our role in that. And in part, our role in that is trying to understand how that paradigm shift is happening and help others to use it to get a more powerful change to overcome the sorts of problems that we've seen. So for those that get bored in presentations easily, take a quick screenshot here and you might amuse yourself over the next 8 minutes by trying to work out who all these people are. But for me, they're really critical systems leaders. And when I'm trying to learn about how to understand how to change a system, these are the sorts of people I'm working with to understand what that means and how that's done. So what if I'm an academic and I'm trying to work out what this leading change in a system actually looks like? And most people think of academics, they think of the photo on the right, and I sort of see myself as a mix of those two there. And really, there's two roles you have as an academic when you're looking at leading change in systems. I won't talk much about the first, except to acknowledge that you are someone who's working within a system, and that's that system of universities and academic promotion and having to get publication and staying funded and all those sorts of things. It's important to understand you have a role in leading how that system evolves. So you need to understand that, adapt it, and in a lot of cases overcome. I'll talk generally, but a lot of university systems are not easy to navigate. Our funding situation is difficult, and there's a role for you to navigate that as you become leaders in that system to help improve that for those that come next. And so a lot of conversations that happen at university leadership level are how to improve this system for EMCRs, how do we overcome a lot of the issues that are facing us. But I'm going to talk more in my remaining time about working on the system as a scientist. So what's our role as somebody who's taken on this role of a scientist, and how do we help solve the big questions? Particularly, how do we use our knowledge to develop, implement, and evaluate efforts for change? And particularly, how does systems science fit into that? And I kind of think of it, what we're really trying to do is develop a method, and we'll call it a scientific method, because we're then able to work project by project to learn from those who are working in these systems to be able to create more powerful change. So we heard Lucy talk about the evidence-based shift. That was a really important shift to begin applying best knowledge earlier in the process. How do we do that work at scale? So how do we make these processes that get us a more powerful outcome happen at a bigger level? And how do we help those who actually have to lead this change to make it easier for them? And Katina talked about how to help the shift happen for policymakers, and understanding the different influences on people, that we see a p-value and wonder why people can't understand that we should just ban tobacco tomorrow, and yet that's a 60-year mission. And that's a 60-year mission because it's more complex than just a health problem, and that's a really important thing to remember. I think as academics, it is important for us to understand what we mean when we say systems. And again, I showed that second slide because it means different things to different people, but part of our role is to make some sense of that and be able to say, well, when we say the word system, this is what we mean. And these are just a couple of my favorite definitions, and you'll see they pick up on a lot of the themes you've already heard. So we're talking about the interconnected set of elements that are organised in a way that achieves something, and that something may be good or bad: health system, education system, systems of policy, some of the criminal policy positions that our country's had in the last 100 years that Janine talked about. They were deliberately done to achieve an outcome, and we need to acknowledge that system was created to then be able to understand how to interact with that, deal with it, and improve it. I also like Penny Hoare's description where we're stressing the importance of relationships, feedback, and interactions amongst the system's parts. So we need to understand what all the key parts are and how they interact with each other, how these things change over time, how they're dynamic, how they interact with each other and create feedback, and the idea that one size doesn't fit all. So we do need to understand that different communities are different contexts are different, and use those. And the last one here is not in a textbook, but systems are tangled and evolving beasties. They change over time. And so the traditional academic way of thinking, righto, I'll understand it once, I'll design my intervention, I'll run it, and then at the end of my 3 years, I'll wonder why it didn't work, and I'll blame those who were supposed to be implementing it. That's the paradigm shift. That's part of the paradigm shift. How do we understand the complexity, understand how things change in real time, and use that to our advantage instead of just pretending it's something we can't control? And we run a lot of interventions in Australia and around the world, a lot of social change projects, a lot of efforts to help people change the system that they're working in. And in every single one of them, there'll be some sort of social or cultural shock. And that might have been 10 years ago, that would be a closing major employer in a town. 5 years ago, it would be bushfires. 2 years ago, it's a global pandemic when no one can leave their house. Yet when we write our research proposal and we set up our plan of work and we develop the actions we think the community should take and we work with them to implement those, we don't actually build in that idea of having to adapt to change as a part of that. And yet that's a really critical part of understanding the system, understanding how it reacts to shocks and changes, and building a response to that into our approach. So that's a big part of the paradigm shift in my view. And there's a bit of a misnomer that we're starting from zero here. It's really not true. There's a wealth of knowledge, years and years and decades of thinking and science about what system means and how you might think about changing systems. I'm just showing a few here. And again, the people on slide 2 have an intuitive version of that, have their own training. But as academics, it's on us to understand this literature, to understand how to translate that, and to help make sense of what's the most useful approach at the right time. I've got a slightly more boring, more complicated slide that makes this point, where there's a tradition of more than 50 or 60 different approaches to thinking about a system. All of them have their own methods, all of them have their own epistemologies, all of them have their own theoretical frameworks. And if we as academics have the social contract of we'll be trained, we'll be supported, we need to be able to say to the people we're working with, there's more than one way you can think about this. And I've spent my time thinking about it, and I think there's a couple you should consider that will be most useful for the way that you're approaching that. That's a really important thing to be able to do if we're aiming to lead a system to change it, or to support others to lead a system to change it. We as academics need to know what that looks like so that we can help them do that in the most effective way. And I mean, essentially, that's another way of saying evidence-based practice. For systems science, this is the evidence base. And I won't labour this too much, but I will just make the point that we can think of systems in lots of different ways. There's a huge amount here, but everything from the sort of surface level insight, which is we know there's a system out there and we probably need to understand how that works a bit so that we can make sense of it and use it in our response. And we might be doing pictures and diagrams to do that, to slightly more in-depth understanding, explanation of where we could intervene, what change might look like, what those structures look like. And there's ways we can do that with models and maps. And then there's a deeper level of insight, which works in two different ways. I've got mathematical simulation models because that's a Western view of it. But again, as you've heard earlier in this talk, and I hope you're getting the point that there are lots of different ways of understanding systems in depth. And it's on us to not privilege one of these approaches above others, but to try and work out which are most helpful to creating effective social change. And this is just an example of a very formal way of thinking about what a system looks like. And this is 20 years of experience in community-based interventions and starting to think about, well, what are the components that have to interact with each other to make community-based intervention work? And this, in this case, obesity. How do they work with each other? And there's a whole bunch of conventions and symbols here that help to tell this story. But it's our job to make this easy for people to understand and to use. And this is the full version of the same picture. So for us looking at this for the first time, this looks incredibly complicated. And if I was looking at it and I'd never seen it before, I'd throw my hands up and say, well, here go the academics again, just making things complicated for the sake of it. But our challenge is to be able to understand and capture the complexity from the point of view of those we're here to serve, and communicate it in a way that makes it useful and applicable. That's really the point I'm trying to make. And for our group, we hit a point about maybe 6 years ago now, where the paradigm shift that Lucy was talking about in prevention was happening, and people were saying, we need communities to lead the work. We need leaders within the community to take ownership, but we also need them to understand, or they need to understand complexity and use it as part of their response. So on one hand, we really need local leadership. But on the other hand, that local leadership really needs to be able to communicate how they see the complexity as a group. And we invented some software called Sticky to do this. And this looks like a terribly complicated picture. It's a complex picture. This is how Southwest Sydney sees all of the influences on child health within Southwest Sydney. So this is not academic language. This is not an academic's point of view. This is the community in Southwest Sydney saying, if we were to think about all the things that affect the health of our kids, this is what that looks like. And so what we're really doing is giving that community the language and the tools to talk with each other and communicate about how the complexity looks, so they can use it as the basis for creating meaningful and more cohesive change. And you heard Lucy talk a little bit about networks as well, and it's hard to see here, but the underlying system that this community is interested in is here from their point of view. The hollow boxes here are, I think this is 3 months in, they're mapping the actions they've developed to act on this. And here, these are actors or people or groups and the relationships between them. The point I want to make here is not so much, isn't this an amazing, fabulous picture, but there are tools and ways of helping people do the science of systems change. And in this case, we've co-developed this with more than 200 communities we've worked with that are useful and meaningful. So if I bring that back to the implications for the scientists and the sorts of things I'd ask you to consider when you're thinking about leading systems for prevention, I think it's really important not to let perfect be the enemy of the good. And what I mean by that is a lot of things are working that it's easy to dismiss because they're not an RCT, as Lucy said, or they haven't been funded by the NHMRC. And you know, once it's funded by the NHMRC, it's fairly well embedded. But what can we learn that we might normally overlook? I think it's critical to listen first, and that's why I showed the second slide the way I did. You know, our job as academics is to understand how things work, but there's a lot of people who understand that intuitively who can teach us. To do that, we have to accept it'll be uncomfortable and difficult. If it was easy and we knew the answer, it wouldn't be research and we wouldn't have to ask difficult questions to try and solve those. And so if I think about publishing our work 5 years ago, we couldn't find reviewers. It was impossible because nobody else had been doing the work we were doing. And now we can get reviewers and we get asked to review papers all the time. But it's not going to be easy because it's new. I showed you some resources before, but you need to know your stuff. You know, you need to know your onions. You need to be able to work with the partners, be they politicians, community members, leaders of organisations, implementation specialists, and be able to say, there's lots of ways you could think about this. There's 2 or 3 I think that might be useful. What do you think? Rather than, I know how this should be done and why aren't you doing it my way? I hope I've made the point that communication is really important, and finding ways to make the work you've understood, the complexity science you've understood, easy for people to understand and use. And in so doing, you're serving the problem and the people and worrying about getting the outcome that suits best rather than worrying about, you know, the other superfluous priorities. And I think the critical thing is to be easy to learn with. So if I go back to that slide too, the joy of all of the journey I've had in trying to understand systems science is working with those systems leaders. And quite often you'll be halfway through a piece of work with them and you'll realise you're much better to be quiet and listen and learn together, because that's really where the power is. So thank you very much for your attention for that time. The slides will be circulated, I think, and I have just put a list of some of the papers that might be of interest around the different sorts of methods you might consider using in system science. And I'll close it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. That was really great insight into the role of the academic in the system, and how and why we should be using systems thinking to kind of understand community perspectives, and to be able to communicate and listen to them. I'm now going to be introducing Jane Martin. Jane's substantive role is to lead the Obesity Policy Coalition, a partnership between Cancer Council Victoria, Diabetes Victoria and Globe. The OPC advocates for policy and regulatory reform to prevent overweight and obesity with a focus on food marketing, labelling and pricing measures. She oversees the Cancer Council Healthy Weight campaigns and is involved in advocating for alcohol policy reforms at a Victorian as well as national level. For more than 30 years, Jane's worked in public health advocacy, engaging in tobacco control, alcohol policy and obesity prevention. Her interests lie in research, knowledge translation and partnerships to support reform. Jane was awarded a Deakin Honorary Doctorate for her contribution to public health advocacy in 2018 and the Public Health Association's President's Award in 2019. She's the co-chair of the National Alliance for Action on Alcohol, president of the Australian New Zealand Obesity Society and a Churchill Fellow. Jane is also a personal hero of mine. She's unfailingly passionate and driven in her work, and I'm sure to many of you an inspiration for those who are hoping to make change. And Jane's going to talk to us today about what works and what doesn't in creating change in systems, going outside your comfort zone and finding good people along the way. Over to you, Jane.
Feel a bit emotional. Thanks for that introduction, Tara. Here I am in my little eyrie in Melbourne, stuck with my COVID positive husband, crossing my fingers that I don't get COVID, but I feel it's just a matter of time. So lovely to be with you. I'm coming from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners wherever you are, and to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people who are here with us today. So I don't have slides. I'm taking a fairly personal view of some of the challenges that I've faced in trying to change the political system, and what I've learnt from that advocacy journey, starting in the 80s in tobacco control. And very interesting to see Katina's example, which I often use, that often the solutions are there, they just take a very long time to get implemented. And I think when you're dealing with commercial actors who are protecting their interests and profits, it's much, much harder. So some of those ideas that Katina and others have referred to, I will reflect in my discussion today. So when I moved from tobacco control into obesity prevention in 2006, there was an election in 2007, and so I had an idea to create a 10-point plan for us as a platform to ask, as election asks in the lead up to the federal election. And in my, as I was talking to people, and I went and spoke to key leaders in the obesity space, some were clinical, some were legal, some were involved in public health. Many of them were involved in research. There weren't many, most of the advocates were involved in research, but what I learned was that there wasn't a lot of advocacy going on. And when I tried to put together 10 policy actions, the suggestion ranged from brief advice in primary care for pregnant women, to healthy school canteens, to free public transport. And many of the suggestions that were made weren't even in the realm of the federal government. They sat with the state government. And that was a real eye-opener to me. In tobacco control, my background was political science. They were pretty savvy advocates. They really knew who had control over the levers that we needed to push. But this was a whole new world. So it made me realise that many of those who were in the system weren't engaged in advocacy, weren't aware, and therefore couldn't advocate for the levers. So as a consequence, we developed a 6-point plan. And to some of you, that might sound familiar because it did form the base of an episode of The Hollow Men. Their first episode on ABC was called Fat Chance. And it was basically based on advice that we'd given to the producers around experience in tobacco control. So the 6-point plan ended up getting lobbied against by commercial interests and funders of government parties, and it ended up being eviscerated, and the only thing that eventuated was a public education campaign. So it was an interesting engagement in public policy, but also a good experience to be involved in political satire. But the point I'd like to make there is you need to understand the system that you want to change in order to influence the system. Another step that we took further down the track was we had another go at developing a platform, and this one was called Tipping the Scales. And the development of that took many years of work, and it was led by Anna Peters and myself. Mostly we did this outside of our day job, and it involved a lot of people, including Tara here, who supported us. But there was a lot of groundwork in identifying potential partners, reviewing the evidence base, putting together a steering committee, and working out a process to identify key actions under each recommendation to address obesity that was in the sphere of action by the federal government. And I can recall thinking with Anna and working with Anna that we really needed to make sure that we had buy-in from a steering committee, an influential and powerful steering committee. So we felt that we needed a little bit more firepower. So we went out to Rob Moody and asked him to help us. And his background was as the chair of the Preventative Health Task Force. And he was a respected medical doctor, academic, and public health advocate. And that his engagement and involvement really helped to cement the commitment of public health leaders, many of whom were men. And I don't think would have heeded the call to participate if it was just Anna and I coming to them, asking them to be engaged. That was a massive project, but it had really significant outcomes because we had more than 43 organisations sign on to that. And we expanded it to cover both prevention and treatment. And just on that point about involving Rob and the steering committee, that was important to consider your spheres of influence, the spheres of influence that people you involve have, and how you can leverage those. So it's that's to Lucy's point around mutual trust and networks. So once we had this platform supported by a number of groups, including groups who were engaged in prevention as well as treatment. These two areas really had been at cross purposes, and there was very little alignment between them as to what they were calling for from government. And it felt like we were kind of competing against each other for a focus. So it was almost like government was being asked either to focus on prevention or focus on treatment. So getting alignment across those two sectors was really critical. And that has also been made clear in an interview that Nicola Roxon gave, based on her experience as the health minister in the Labor government that led the work around the Preventative Health Task Force, which developed recommendations on obesity, tobacco and alcohol. And Don Nutbeaten did this fantastic piece, an interview with her in Public Health Research and Practice. And I think I would recommend it for anyone working in public health. But she said in Australia, it's been harder to garner support for strong interventions on alcohol and obesity. On obesity in particular, the mixed approaches from advocates and researchers about what is needed to be successful have made it more difficult for governments to act decisively. When multifactorial approaches are likely to be needed, this can make the ask confusing. Governments often want a clear plan or a clear starting point, and in some public health areas, it's often hotly contested where one should start. The challenge to advocates on these issues and most other public health priorities is to find that lever, the right lever, at the right time for the decision maker you're trying to convince. Be careful, of course, not to weaken the argument by going in too many directions at once. Developing alliance across consumers, clinicians, advocates and researchers will always be very powerful. The same proposal from multiple groups gives your argument weight and depth. So the importance of having a shared agenda and bringing people around a shared agenda is really important. But in doing that, the thing that I've learned is don't focus on what you want out of it. just stay open and focus on getting an outcome, because it will come across if you've got a vested interest. And really you want that to be a group process. Obviously, that's going to be informed by evidence, and I'm pretty passionate about evidence. It's not the only thing, but it's really important. And I had an idea of setting up a research sort of hub, an obesity evidence hub, and we had something similar in tobacco control, a platform which held a synthesized evidence base that was continually updated in line with the research, aimed at bureaucrats, secondary, tertiary students, policymakers and practitioners. I developed the idea probably 10 years ago, wrote a funding proposal and put it to my manager at the time, who rejected it. And I was pretty upset. I thought it was a good idea. I represented it twice more, because I do things in three. I try 3 times, framed the argument differently each time, but it was still rejected. But luckily I bumped into my CEO in the bike cage at work, and I put it to him and he supported it. So it became accepted internally. And I think that's one of my other points. Advocacy begins at home. Often it starts within your own organisation. The initial proposal was massaged over the years. It was ambitious. And after pitching it to multiple funders and philanthropists, it continued to founder. So it was shelved. But a few years ago, the opportunity presented itself with the Obesity Collective, where Simon Chapman raised the idea of a hub similar to that in tobacco control for obesity. And although I wasn't present at the meeting, I read the minutes and saw it as an opportunity to revive the proposal, bring it to Steve Simpson, who approached the Bupa Foundation for funding. This was successful, and my team brought the project to life. It's now been funded for the next 3 years by the Commonwealth Department of Health as part of a funding package with the Obesity Collective. So to Katina's point, you need perseverance, persistence and energy to keep pushing an idea if you believe in it. So I think my key takeaways would be persistence, have the energy to keep going, go outside your comfort zone. If you're not scared, you should think about whether, if you're not scared, you should worry whether you should do it or not. I spend most of my time feeling quite scared. It's good. You need to be uncomfortable. You need to stretch yourself, but you also need to surround yourself with people who will support you. Don't do it alone. Ask people for help. We've all had our journeys. We all want to support you coming through as emerging leaders. Thanks for the opportunity, Tara. And yeah, it's great to hear all the other presenters as well. Fantastic insights.
Thanks so much, Jane. So now we're going to go to the Q&A session. So thanks to everyone who has sent some questions through. There's still time if you want. So I might start with Katina. We've got quite a few questions for you. So we had a few people that were interested in the citizens jury approach and whether that's kind of commonly used to guide decision-making in legislative reform in South Australia. Can you comment on that?
Sure, thank you. No, not commonly. We have used it a couple of times though, deliberately. I think that citizens' juries are really interesting. I'm very attracted to the idea that we enable a group of people over a period of time. So we're not rushing them. It's not the equivalent of a focus group, for example. But what we're actually doing is saying to a group of people, we have this problem, can you help us with it? And then the group of people actually get to control who it is they hear from. So they're the ones who decide, I want to know about this, I want to know about that, or we want to know more, and they can call the presenters back whenever they like. So they have the power in this. And then the group gets to think about it. They get to be fully informed in the manner in which they've chosen. And then from that, they make a decision. What I really like about that, I mean, we tend to use, you can equally use surveys, what do people think? You can use focus groups to get into the detail, but actually, in many instances, I wouldn't consider that a proper process of engagement because not everybody has access to the information in the first place. And so it's much more respectful to go through a process of everyone kind of understanding the issue to then be able to give a view. We have recently done a similar one with it was called an Aboriginal Bowel Council. What we were trying to do was to understand the acceptability of changing the bowel screen program to reduce the age for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in South Australia. This was on the back of other work we'd done on cost effectiveness for doing that, but we really wanted to know from the community, is this acceptable? We also understood that that could be a simple question and people answer simply, but that really wasn't what we wanted. We wanted to understand, is this actually acceptable? Given people understand that, colonoscopies have side effects, there are risks involved, so it's a more balanced view. I think it can be used in different phases in your change process. It might be that you need to put something on the agenda, and we've certainly seen those with obesity. But we've deliberately used them right at the end to shift the decision maker today. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Katina. And Jane, I'm wondering if you'd like to reflect on other uses of citizens' juries.
Just to note that Vic Health undertook a citizens' jury approach around obesity. Anna Peters was involved as well. I think there were two flaws in my view with that, and it was an amazing process. It was just extraordinary to be a part of, because they kind of brought you in when they wanted to ask questions. It was fascinating, and they worked so hard. But they had the food industry involved who weren't happy with some of the outcomes. And the other thing was it didn't have government involved. So that huge stakeholder was missing. And I think you need that leadership and engagement from the very beginning of government. And it's worked very well with local governments too, because, you are speaking to your constituency. So I think, it didn't really kind of get the traction that it could have. And I was just amazed how what brilliant solutions sort of came forward once people had considered the information, and how they responded and reacted. They really, I remember leaving one of the meetings on a tram, and some of the citizen jury were talking to me about what they were doing. They were very, very engaged. It was a great process, actually.
Thanks, Jane. So I'm now going to shift a question for Steve. We've actually had a few questions around trying to kind of communicate the value of systems to funders. One of the questions is, how can we facilitate this paradigm shift down to the line of funders to start funding research into systems and implementation and scale up, as well to our policy and practice partners? So just a small question.
Yeah, it's a billion-dollar question, and I think you've heard the line several times. Translation of new things into practice is a 17 or 18-year wait time. So that's the benchmark that we're trying to beat. Might be one way of thinking about it. What we've seen to be most powerful, and it sort of speaks to the engagement and leadership stuff that we've just been talking about, is actually people experiencing these processes is far more powerful than trying to sell them. So when we first started doing workshops to work with people to use system science, we used to think we had to do a 3-hour lecture on system science so that the CEO of council and the local politicians and the key community leaders would believe us that we knew what we were talking about. And we created a feedback loop which said, what would we do to improve this session? They said, well, get rid of the 3 hours would be a good start. And what should we reduce it to? About 2 minutes would be about right. And the power of the work should be in the process. It should be fairly self-evident, really, but particularly in the approaches that people on the call are taking, is to engage those key leaders to say, how does this look from your point of view? Where are the points of leverage, and what are the changes that need to be made? And Jane just said the ideas that come from the people who work in these systems are transformative. What's missing is quite often the process and the language and the structure to make them visible. And it's the same with the citizens jury Katina was talking about. the ability to empower communities to use this thinking is probably one of the secrets. So we went through a big round of frustration where we knew this was working to prevent various chronic diseases, and we knew it was really important, and we couldn't get the ear of politicians. And then we got the ear of politicians because communities were saying, we'd rather do this system stuff than the stuff you're making us doing. And that set us back a while because, those that hold the purse strings don't typically like to hear that. And we're now getting to the point where I think everybody's starting to see the power and the value. And again, our role is to translate that, is to communicate that. So how you do that, I think, is you have to make it really visible. I think you have to make it really easy to understand. And I think you have to be able to say in sort of minute one, this isn't right or wrong. It's one way of doing it, but it's worth a try. And then what we've seen is the best advocates for what we do are a long way outside universities. So it's people we work with saying to the politicians and leaders, this is actually a really valuable way of approaching this problem. We'd like to do it this way. And we just happen to be the people that help them do it, right? We're not the heroes of the piece. If this ever works, we're not even in the photo. We're a long way down the line from who gets the trophy when this stuff works. Hopefully that's a bit helpful.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. And I might just ask a follow-up question because we've had some interest in kind of hearing about examples of methods that you might use in system science. And I might add to that around, what you've kind of talked that there are a lot of different approaches and terminologies to describe systems. Is there one right way to do it, or are there better ways to do it?
It's really context specific would be one thing to say. So different methods will suit different groups of people, and there's lots of different ways. And approaches are like toothbrushes. Everybody's got one, and nobody wants to use anybody else's. They want to stick to their own. We use participatory approaches with a real emphasis on co-creation because we genuinely believe that local ownership is important, and we genuinely believe that our role is to serve groups of people to find the right way that makes sense for them, informed by the evidence, of course. So we use a lot of techniques from something called community-based participatory systems dynamics, which is a horrible mouthful, but there's a really nice book written by Peter Hovman. But really, every time we do a piece of work, every single time, the first thing we do at the end of it is, how can that be better? What can we do to improve that? So the way that we approach any new project now is informed by thousands and thousands and thousands of people helping us understand how to improve our techniques and our technologies and our approaches and our presentations, those sorts of things.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So I've got a question from Maddie Heenan. So I'll direct it at Jane first, but Katina and Steve, you might also want to comment afterwards. But so we have a workshop this afternoon that's all focused on relationship building, and you touched on this in your presentation, but could you provide some more examples of how important relationships are in your policy and advocacy work, and relationships with which groups? So what type of stakeholder groups?
Yeah, look, it's the absolute glue that helps you to achieve what you want to achieve. And sometimes it can take a long time, but if you watch how the food industry develop trust, they're very personal. They talk about their families, they talk about their children. I remember being at a meeting about sugar, and one of the representatives talked about taking his child to a dietitian. I just didn't think it was true, but he illustrated a point using his own family. So those, I can see how important that sort of PR is for industry to create those relationships and develop that. The health star rating negotiations were just another example, but developing that trust is so critical. You want a minister's advisor to be able to call you at any time and ask for support or help, and you have to start those relationships somewhere, and they will move around. And we've just got a new health minister in Victoria. We've lost all our network. We have to start again. We've got a new food minister, Jed Carney. We have to start again. But, I bumped into a friend at the market, and she was saying that, Jed was, quite interested in women's issues. I used to be on the board of Family Planning Victoria. I'm going to use that network to support my relationship with Jed. So you have to understand that we're all human. these are all people. They all have interests. You will have shared interests. They have the interests of the community at heart, like you, and they want to hear from you, and they want to know where to find you. They want to know what you can offer. And often when I do meet with politicians, their advisors, I ask them, what do you need? What research do you need? What will help you to achieve what you want to achieve? But I will have read their maiden speech. I will have tried to find out what the politician is interested in. I'll understand what the policy environment is, like what are the plans, what are the strategies that sit there. So you have to do your homework, and you mustn't waste people's time. I worked in a politician's office for a senator. They're very, very busy people. They work really long hours. The bells might ring if you're in Parliament. You just have to have your key messages, the same way you're doing it to your CEO in the bike cage. That's the same thing the way you have to operate, but you have to develop that relationship. And sometimes it is a friendship as well, but those relationships are critical. And I'm sure Katina can speak to that with her experience in that system. But those relationships stand you in very good stead, and it's very well worth the investment.
Yeah, Katina, I'd love to hear from you on that as well.
Yeah, look, I completely and utterly agree. And I just really wanted to echo as well the point that Jane makes about understanding everybody else's perspective. That it is the basic tenet, for example, the health and all policies type approach. That's just how the WHO calls it. But in reality, what that is where is our collective agenda? And that was really what I was trying to get at in my presentation. So, the Animal Welfare League, for example, and injury prevention would not normally come together on an issue, but we were able to find the intersect. We in South Australia have recently, you will be aware, passed abortion reform, so we now have the Termination of Pregnancy Act. That could not be a more stark example of the need for basically collective action. Now it's a little bit different because it doesn't necessarily mean that people in government are engaging directly with advocates, but in something like that, everybody knows what everyone's agenda is. And so sometimes in government, it's much wiser to not directly engage with advocates, but know that they're there and they're doing their part. So we're basically working in a team that doesn't necessarily communicate and collaborate. That's really important because in government, for example, we must maintain a position of neutrality. And if we're not neutral, we actually open ourselves up to the whole thing falling over. So I just really want to acknowledge that we absolutely highly value advocates, even if we don't reach out and speak to advocates. We're often on a collective path.
Great, thanks, Katina. I don't know, Steve, if you wanted to add anything there.
It's probably just reinforcing that. I think some of the biggest breakthroughs in understanding we've ever had is at that time after a meeting or over a cup of tea or after you've established a level of trust where you're able to just say, so explain it from your point of view. Tell me what it is you're hoping to get out of this. What are the, one of the best directions is what are the problems you're trying to work out how to solve and what would be a useful, what would a solution look like? I think it's too easy for us to assume we have to go in and know the answer. And it's the worst possible way to approach it because it just closes every single door. Whereas if your approach is, can you tell us how this looks from, which is essentially what our process is, but can you tell us how it looks from your point of view? Where is the good stuff? Where is more work needed? And what would help to make that happen look like? That's a completely different conversation to a medical model, which is there is a tablet and you've just got to take it on Monday at 10 o'clock and everything will be okay. And that's a paradigm shift that we're talking about, I think.
Thanks, Steve. So we've got a few questions that kind of relate to this idea of perseverance, which has been brought up by a couple of you. So we've got a question, I think it's a double whammy. I'm going to combine a few questions here. So firstly, how do you deal with the frustration of seeing all of these possible solutions get continually ignored? And then a second question, which I think relates to this, is what strategies do you employ to keep momentum going? So I might ask Katina to speak first.
That's really interesting. How do you stop getting annoyed? Well, I think one of the things that probably carries me is this probably ridiculous, but absolute faith that we will absolutely get this in the end. Like, I just think, oh yes, well, this is just a bit of a setback. You don't really know what you're doing. We'll keep going. It is kind of like that concept of the North Star. If it's firm and so this is why when you're deciding on a North Star, you need to really make that decision very carefully. You need to think about, is this the best step forward? Is this, in the strategy of what comes in what order? I will spend an awful lot of time thinking about that personally, because now we're talking about our personal perseverance, I guess, rather than a collective perseverance. But yeah, once I know, like, that's it, that's my number one, I just keep going. And I see it as a challenge, like a duel. Well, you've done that, but that's okay, because now I can do this. And sometimes you just actually have to wait. Like, sometimes you hold things, and you might hold, and I've definitely held ideas for 3 or 4 years until the time is right. So you don't also waste your time. I think that's another thing. So holding on to something over a decade, it doesn't mean that I'm doing it every day. It just means that I'm ready for when the time is right. I'm now going to move. And okay, I've moved forward one step, but now I need to stop and wait again. I can't remember the next part. I got taken by the frustration bit.
What strategies do you employ to keep momentum going?
Yeah, I guess, well, that timing thing is important. I don't know that I use very much else other than that firm belief that the right thing will happen in the end. I think also, though, I will echo the point that Stephen made earlier, that in public health as well, it's really super important that your ego is not in the middle. And I think Jane also referenced this. If it looks like you're too much or too biased or always saying the same thing, the people are just going to ignore you. The best secret of public health that I can share, that I learned from a previous mentor, Dr. Ron Summers, who used to run injury and epi actually in South Australia, is that your best bet is to convince other people that it was their decision and their fantastic idea in the first place. So you should be invisible. So when the reform happens, nobody has any idea that it was you. And so I guess what I'm saying is, if ego and what you can put on your CV is what you're after, is probably not public health. If you want to be successful, that is. We're the ones who are kind of inserting the idea, rolling the ball, helping guide, bringing stakeholders together. But what we are not is the centre of attention.
Thanks, Katina. That's fascinating. Jane, I saw you nodding along to some of those points.
Yeah, I mean, I so agree with Katina. I mean, timing is everything, and you don't have control over that. And I remember with taxing tobacco, we just did so much work on modelling and stuff, and it sat in that top drawer for ages until the time was right. And that's what you need. You need to have all your ducks lined up. That's why we did that model, paid for that research to model a tax on sugary drinks of 20% and the impact of that on the Australian population. At some stage, that's going to be used again, and it's important to have that, and those questions will be asked. So you need to you're always preparing, you're always making sure that you're ready, because you don't know when that call's going to come, and it will come. That happens. These are not, implementation's always the problem, but I agree with Katina. We're on the right track. We're on the right track. It's just that, the decision makers aren't ready yet, but we have to be ready when they're ready. And I think, I don't know, my daughter's studying entrepreneurship, but now I feel like I'm a bit of a health entrepreneur. I hadn't thought about myself like that, but I think we are quite creative people. I mean, my sister's an artist. My brother's a ceramicist. I'm kind of semi-academic, but you have to keep creating, because you have to take those learnings. You have to be an entrepreneur. You have to represent. You have to reframe, and you have to grow and learn as well. So that's the kind of fun bit. I'm just scared I'm going to die and not see any change happen. That's what I'm really worried about. But maybe that's just, I just want to see that progress. So maybe I'm a bit like Rosemary Stanton, who's not retiring until she sees added sugar on the label. Maybe I'll be like, I'm not retiring until we have a levy on sugary drinks. But that's, I'm like Katina, and I think that's why you stay in that system. If you can handle it, if you can manage it, if you can cope with it, if you're not feeling like it's failure, it's a step towards where you think things should be. It's just about doing that and trying to think of, we've been doing all this work on values-based messaging. It's so interesting. I think it's so important. And there'll always be new things that you can integrate, new networks you can make, new approaches, new research. It's fun. Keep it fun.
Thanks, Jane. Steve?
Yeah, I think it's a useful place to come back to that distinction between working in a system and working on a system. So every time you write a grant and go for funding and go for promotion, you're supposed to be the hero of the piece, and you've got to do that bit at the same time as you've got to respond to this idea, well, actually, we're not the hero of the piece and we're not supposed to be the hero of the piece. So within our system, we have to be able to say we committed to this policy document, we made this contribution. It's really important to hold that. But, in asking the question, how do you deal with the frustration of things taking so long to change? I think smoking is a pretty classic example. If all it was the evidence in about, what was the doctor's study, Jane, about 1948 or something like that, we had pretty unequivocal evidence that smoking was bad for you, caused cancer, heart disease, would kill you. Like, it's pretty unequivocal. And we still haven't banned tobacco completely. But we've made huge steps. So one is there's huge steps we've made, hold on to that. But the second thing is you start asking the question, well, if the evidence isn't enough, what else is it? And that's where the question about complexity and systems starts becoming really critical. So the influences on why a policy changes is not because there's a p-value. And sometimes the p-value is helpful, but, we did a piece of work on looking on how closing the gap policy was made, and the evidence doesn't feature very highly. It's part of the story, but it's maybe 5 to 10% of the story. So if we're working on the system and we're trying to create social change, part of our responsibility is to understand how that system behaves and how it works. And those are the points about relationships, about understanding policy windows, about understanding mutual needs. Everybody wants people to be healthier. No doubt about it. Nobody wants their kids to be sick. Nobody wants people to get smoking-related disease. And yet we can't make what to health people seems obvious changes we could make tomorrow that will create change. There's a different question to, well, why are people so stupid and don't listen to the evidence? The question is, what does it take to make the change happen? And why aren't I helping press those other levers as well? And that's a very different question. But, if you think, and then another way of thinking about it is, how quickly did it take us to shut the borders when there was a pandemic? So why is it we can mobilize a response like that under one sort of threat and not after another? And people will have seen various presenters talk about obesity as a 30-year crisis. Well, it is, and it's also a minute-by-minute crisis, but a minute-by-minute crisis gets a better response. So that long-term frustration, I think part of what this system science allows us to do is to understand the broader context and use that as a part of trying to create change.
Thanks, Steve. And I've just got a follow-up question for you, Steve, that's kind of more about the academic system. So you mentioned it, but kind of didn't go into it. And I'm just wondering if you kind of have any thoughts on where we should be focusing our efforts for improving the academic system for early career researchers, because sometimes it feels quite fatiguing to be working within a system, trying to succeed within the system, trying to create change in other systems, and trying to reform the system, the academic system at the same time. So a small question again.
Yeah, it's pretty easy things to do. From an EMCR's point of view, I think being visible and vocal is really useful. So, everybody in the system is in their own spot, seeing it from their own point of view. And, there are some structures that are really oriented. So at the institute where I work, we have committees that are all about building EMCR capacity, and we have programs of work, but they rely on the EMCRs being involved in helping us identify the problems and see what's useful. So within, there are resources, but people have got to put their hands up and say, I want to help make this better. That'd be the first thing to say. I don't know, but I've said for a long time, and maybe it's not true, that it seems to me the cycle we're in is quite, it is cyclical. So we've got to eventually reach a point in time where governments realise and learn that it can't keep going like this, and we're sort of cutting ourselves off at the knees in terms of scientific and technological development. I think it will turn, but that's easy to say and hard to do. So I don't have easy answers, but I would say that wherever you are, you should advocate up and listen to those around you and make sure that those voices are heard. So, Tara, for example, your involvement in EMCRs is really important because you're a conduit for all of those voices to be heard. And, if those who you think can help you aren't listening, you need to find another way to get their attention and get them to listen.
Thanks, Steve. So I've got about 5 minutes left in this session. And so I think what I'm going to do is ask each of the speakers to reflect on if there's kind of one piece of advice or one thing that you'd want the emerging leaders watching today to come out of today, and how they can enact change in prevention research, policy or practice. What would it be? So, Katina?
Oh dear, only one thing. I do think, I've talked about perseverance. I think that's really critical. But I guess one thing that I haven't spoken about is that it's really important when you're in the midst of the actual change process, not the bit before, that you are very conscious of protecting the process. So as a person working in government, I know you've got some people here who are policy people, that we mustn't expose our ministers. So if we're trying to get change through, we're on one side. That side is to try and get the change through and work with the government of the day. That is not the time, for example, to go writing public pieces. It's not the time to go doing media to kind of push. The push doesn't work. When you're a government, that's the job of the advocates, the people outside of government, to be doing that at the same time. Our job is to protect the process internally, because as soon as we look like we're pushing, we'll probably not be successful.
Thanks, Katina. Steve, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm going to have two. I'm going to say be brave and be good. So be brave means pick the hard thing, because, some of the easy thing's been done. So pick the hard thing and work on it. And be good, I think, really picks up Katina's point. Understand what good looks like, what integrity looks like, what good process looks like, and role model it and advance it. They'd be the two things I'd focus on. And if you're brave and you're good, the other stuff looks after itself.
Thanks, Steve. Jane?
I think it can be quite daunting when you are dealing with the commercial determinants of health and the corporations and the power and influence that sits behind that. And I've had times when I've had these disgusting op-eds written about me. My children have been mentioned in tweets from members of the Institute of Public Affairs. It's, it can get pretty unpleasant. So I think it's really important to surround yourself with people that can support you. Please don't let that deter you from entering the fray. We have to challenge, we have to speak truth to power. We need to really empower to be women, to build their careers and to take, be confident out there in the world. You have to take on these industries and you need to be confident to do that. So when I've had horrible things happen, sometimes on a Friday, Saturday morning, I've got an inbox full of people and calls, and that's exactly what you need. And prepare yourself for that. But it is frightening. But I think we all need to sort of be brave, put our head above the parapet, and fight for what's right. It's really, really important. And as emerging leaders, it can be really daunting and frightening. But keep practicing and know you're on the right side, and look at all the sort of people around here who are leaders because that's what they have done. It's really important.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to our wonderful plenary speakers for staying and giving us those fascinating insights, into how we can create change within systems and persevere and not give up. So before we go to break, I'm just going to pass on to Bryony Hill, who's going to introduce the next session. Thanks, Bryony.
Thanks, Tara. So coming up at 12 o'clock, we have a networking session, and it's a little bit different than your typical online networking session. When you enter the networking room, so after a short break, I'll invite you to use the CrowdComms website or app to enter the networking room, and you'll see a whole bunch of different tables with different topics. And we have invited some of the workshop facilitators and some CERI experts to hang around on those tables, and there are different topics there that you can join discussions in. So I would love for you to hover around the tables, have a look at what's there, and join a table that you want to. To join a table, you put your cursor or your bubble next to another person, and that will join you to a Zoom call with that group. So we encourage you to move around to the different tables throughout the session, have a little conversation. The tables are being facilitated so that you can ask questions of the experts if you like, or have a chat with some of your colleagues. So we would love for you to go have a little stretch break, grab yourself a coffee or a piece of fruit, and we'll see you back in the CrowdComms app at 12 o'clock to join the networking session.